All right, back at you with another Stopping Socialism video. I'm Donald Kendall, joined by Justin Haskins. So we've done a couple of videos about basically the stuff that Justin has been uncovering from these old documents of the militant, some old socialist rag from back in the 80s, about our good old comrade Bernie Sanders. And Justin says to me, you know what? I'm not even going to call him a socialist anymore. I'm going to call him a communist because that's what he is. So I want to have a video about that. Justin, are you going a little far there? I mean, is he really? Are you just going for clickbait? Is he really a communist?
Well, I do love clickbait. Everybody knows that. But you know what? I actually no. He is a communist. See, I think one of the interesting things about Bernie Sanders and really the modern socialist movement in general is that the people who are most opposed to it don't really know what a lot of these terms mean. A lot of people don't know what they mean. It's really strange. Communism, I used to think communism, and maybe you felt the same way before we started doing all this. I used to think that communism meant the jackboot wearing stormtrooper murdering people in the street version of socialism.
Sure.
That's what I thought it meant. It was more state control, more centralization, more
regime.
Yeah, like take socialism and put it on all the bad things about socialism, put it on steroids, murder people in the streets, you got communism. That's kind of what I thought it was. But when I actually started getting challenged by communists who ironically call themselves socialists, I guess, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand that, I started reading what Karl Marx actually wrote, what he actually believed, what a lot of other early socialists and communists actually wrote and believed. And what you find out is that being a communist doesn't mean that the government is authoritarian. That's not necessarily what it means. Now, that's what ends up happening whenever you try to implement these things. But communism is actually a wildly idealistic brand of socialism. Socialism is sort of a big tent word, and communism fits within socialism. I don't actually view socialism as a stepping stone toward communism.
Sure.
I believe it's part of socialism. So what is communism exactly? Well, according to Karl Marx, communism is sort of this final perfect end state of the socialist ideal, where you're going to have this society where everything or almost everything, most things, at least everything in terms of the economy, are collectively owned and managed by the people. That doesn't necessarily mean it's all centralized. You could theoretically have cooperatives everywhere. Every business is cooperatively managed by the workers or something like that. It doesn't mean you have a state running and controlling everything necessarily. Although again, that's how it always ends. So communism is sort of this final perfect utopian end state where everything is collectively owned and managed, all, voluntarily was the idea, ideally. And so everyone would collectively own these things, and the world would be this wonderful place because you wouldn't have any classes. You wouldn't have rich people and poor people because everything's collectively owned and managed. That was really what Karl Marx was shooting for in the long run. Now, he had some really disturbing ideas about how we would have to get there, what we might have to do in order to get there. But that's what communism really is. Socialism can mean a bunch of different things, including that. There are a lot of socialists who are also communists, but there are socialists who are not communists, who believe we're never going to get to this idealistic state. We're going to have this world where ideally most of the economy is collectively owned and managed, but people still have some markets and there are still some private property ownership to some degree or whatever. But people need to understand that difference. So when I say that Bernie Sanders is a communist, I don't mean he wants to murder people in the streets. What I mean is Bernie Sanders has some extremely radical views. He's wildly idealistic. And ultimately what he believes is all economic decisions should be made collectively.
Yeah. So let me jump in there because I see on our Facebook page, there's always that one person that wants to leave a comment that's just like, socialism is just a snowplow going down your local street. And it's like, no, that's not what we're talking about when we're saying stopping socialism. Yes, obviously, if the government wants to completely take over the healthcare industry, that's socializing that industry, and we're obviously against that. But socialism, when we're talking about it, stopping socialism, is the top-down central planning or orchestrating of the of the economy by the government. And there's various ways that you can do that. And that is what you're getting more of what you're accusing, I guess, Bernie Sanders of truly believing, is that top-down central control of the economy.
Yes, and no. It doesn't necessarily have to be top-down control. Theoretically, you could have a socialist society where you just have a bunch of little cooperatives, or every town collectively owns everything in the town. You could have a system that isn't centralized. It doesn't have to be centralized. It always becomes centralized. I mean, that's the thing. It always happens. And initially, you do have to have some centralization. Yeah. Which is why it always happens, because there is no way to take everybody's property from them unless you have someone powerful enough to take away everyone's property. So it always starts with centralization. And then what happens is it never leaves that phase. It always just becomes worse and worse and worse to varying degrees. And usually that's where you get authoritarianism, is within this centralization. But it doesn't necessarily have to be centralization. To be honest, I don't know if anyone has ever asked Bernie Sanders, "Hey, Bernie, in your perfect world, would all the communist ownership of property be centralized, or would it be town by town?" I don't know that anyone's ever asked him that, even though he would probably love to have that conversation, because I think that's what he believes.
I don't know what he would give lip service to, but like I've read enough of these documents where he's talking about basically his idea of socialism is just injecting democracy into anything. And sure, I mean, you could say that some co-op industry over there, or some business down the corner, or some co-op where it's collectively owned. But then once you start factoring in some of the environmental concerns or whatever, and it's just like the collective is tangentially hurt by the actions of a co-op, then that collective still gets to have some say in what you do and how you operate your business, and whether or not you're exploiting your workers or whatever. So I think, like, holding his feet to the fire, you would definitely get to the point where it's requires centrally controlled central planning.
Yeah, well, this is actually a fantastic topic. I In Socialism is Evil, buy it on Amazon right now, by Justin Haskins. I talk a little bit about how ultimately one of the biggest problems with socialism is that if you have a voluntary socialist society, if you have different groups within that society collectively owning things, but owning them separately, or even if you have separate countries with socialized societies, but they're separate from the rest of the world, ultimately you're going to end up with the thing that socialists say is the most important thing that you cannot possibly have, which is classes.
Sure.
Because different parts of the world have different natural resources. They have different talents. Some groups are more talented than other groups. I'm not talking about racial groups or whatever. I'm just talking about different groups of people in society might gather together and be more productive than other groups in society.
Evil 1%, you know.
Yeah, right. Well, and you could just have a group of miners somewhere that get together, and they're better at mining than some other group of miners somewhere. And so they're going to be more successful, therefore they're going to have more wealth, therefore they're going to be in a better class than the other, right? So over time, you have to have some kind of centralization to prevent the more successful workers from having more wealth than the less successful workers. And so you're always going to have classes without basically a world government. Which is, in my opinion, logically, when you extend socialism out, it has to be a global system. There's no other way around it in order for it to have any hope of working. And it can't possibly work. But you see my point.
Yeah. And we're going off on a little bit of a tangent. So back to the topic at hand. Make the case that Bernie Sanders is a communist. I mean, right. I know that in the political rhetoric now, he wants to socialize the healthcare industry and tax people's money at north of 60% or something along those lines. But what is the case that he is a full-fledged communist?
Right. So keeping in mind what I mean by communist, Bernie Sanders, the reason I believe Bernie Sanders is a communist, number one, Bernie Sanders was calling himself a socialist and associating with socialist groups back when socialism meant something akin to what we're talking about right now. Okay. Yeah. It did not mean Scandinavia. as we understand it today. It did not mean, collectively owned snow plows and roads and things like that. It meant radical redistribution of wealth. We're talking about him calling himself a socialist, going all the way back to the 1970s, and referring to himself as a socialist even in those periods of time, in the 70s and 80s, talking about how he was a socialist when he was 20-something years old. And that was many, many years ago. He's 80-something now. So if you do the math, that would mean that he was referring to himself as a socialist in the heyday of the Soviet Union and the Cambodian killing fields and all of this sort of stuff. So socialism meant something more radical back then than what it means today. So that's number one. And he's been calling himself that for a very long time. Number two, he was promoting communist, not just socialist, but communist, Marxist, communist presidential candidates in the 1980s. Bernie Sanders was not a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, but he did promote two presidential candidates in 1980 and 1984 for the Socialist Workers' Party. And those were communist. That was a communist organization. They were a Marxist socialist group. They were very open about that. They were Trotskyites. And for those of you who don't know what a Trotskyite is, Trotskyite is the followers of Trotsky, who was one of the leaders in the Russian Revolution. And he sort of differed from Stalin, who ended up taking over Russia, in that he believed that in order for communism to work, you had to have the entire world essentially become a communist state, and that should be one of your goals, should be spreading communism all over the world. Stalin wanted to focus mostly on Russia, and he believed that they could do it without the rest of the world becoming a communist state. So this was a Trotskyite group. They were globalists. They believed in a globalist communist movement. And Bernie Sanders was part of that movement. He was advocating for these presidential candidates. He was supporting regimes all over the world in places like Cuba and Nicaragua and elsewhere, talking about how important these movements were. So this guy was a global communist. He supported these ideas very openly. And so I think that is a very important piece of evidence. And then you get little hints of it in all these different interviews that he had, where it's not just talking about one little part of society being collectively owned and managed, but talking about basically everything, talking about overthrowing capitalism, getting rid of the capitalist system, why it's so important for us to eliminate capitalism and have this debate about eliminating not modifying capitalism, not watering capitalism down, getting rid of capitalism. One just really small sort of subtle example of this is he's giving this speech, and this is from an article in 1982. He was giving a speech to, I think it was law students, and Vermont Law School. And he said this. He said, today, Sanders said, control lies in the hands of the 1% of the population that possesses most of the country's wealth. Sound familiar? He talks about that all the time. Yeah. Socialism, the Burlington mayor said, means nothing more than democracy. It means to as great as an extent as possible that ordinary people will have control over their own lives, meaning through democracy. Now, what does that mean? That means collective ownership and management of property through democratic means. And to what extent? To as great an extent as possible. That means communism. That's what communism is. It's democratic. There are many democratic communists. They believe that democratically, the collective should control all of the wealth in society. And that's exactly what he's talking about right here. You get hints of it in all sorts of conversations. So those are just three of the pieces of evidence that I would point to. There are a lot more, but I think you can get the sense of it just from looking at these three pieces of evidence that yes, Bernie Sanders was in fact a communist. He still is, I believe.
All right. So just taking that final statement that you just said there, you said was. Okay, so in the decades that have passed, since some of these crazier things or whatever, could he have potentially moderated? I mean, you see the fall of the Soviet Union, the absolute travesties that happened under Mao and all of that. And just like, the Sweden kind of going sideways for a while until they instituted some free market reforms. Could he have moderated himself? Do you think he has shed some of these crazier planks of like the Communist Manifesto?
I guess it's theoretically possible, right? It is theoretically possible that's exactly what he's doing. The reason why I don't believe that to be the case is because there's no evidence that shows that to be the case. If you're going to provide some evidence that suggests that, yeah, you know what, Bernie Sanders is now not quite as radical as he was before. What is it? Everything that he was saying in the 1970s and 80s, he's still saying today. All of his talking points. Go back and read some of these speeches that he was giving back then. He was saying the same things. He's saying the same things now that he was saying back then. He was obsessing over the 1%, obsessing over these various regimes around the world and how they really weren't that bad. He was talking about the need for sort of nationalizing various industries. He was talking about the wealth gap. He was talking about how capitalism fails people. He's all the same talking points. Nothing has changed. It is possible, I guess, that he changed his mind, but if he did, he never told anyone that. There was a video of him, actually, he was interviewed. It was in the late 1980s, and he was interviewed, if I remember correctly, on C-SPAN. He was in Washington, D.C. for some reason, and C-SPAN was interviewing him, and a caller called up and said, basically, is it true that you were promoting the Socialist Workers' Party, and then this was an organization that people knew was a Trotskyite party, and that you were promoting them, and that you were, basically like a communist or something? That was the inference that the caller made.
Yeah.
And Bernie Sanders basically kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, "Yeah, it is true." And he didn't denounce anything. He didn't denounce anything that the Socialist Workers' Party was talking about. He said that he was not a member of the party, but that he supported the presidential candidates and that he was not ashamed of it. And he just went on and started talking about other issues and talking about how capitalism is terrible and on and on and on. So show me the evidence that he's changed. If he's changed, let's see the evidence for it. I can't find any.
Yeah, and I think somebody would point to like, well, he's done 1 million speeches over the past 8 years running for president, and he hasn't said any Trotsky stuff. And I guess I would be able to counter that with just saying, well, he's running for president and he needs a more general audience. So
that's true.
But it is pretty frightening that he is seemingly the front runner when it comes to becoming the presidential nominee for president under the Democrats. So we are going to continue to do deep dives into this candidate as long as he stays up top and he's not supplanted by Buttigieg or, Bloomberg or something like that. But we'll continue to follow this. If you are interested, please follow us on different social medias. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube. You can subscribe to us on YouTube. We put out a lot of videos like this. And we're also on Instagram. But yeah, absolutely follow us if you want to join us in this crusade of stopping socialism. That's it for today. We'll talk to you tomorrow.